Welcome back to Work and Play Podcast Unlocked, Episode 2, and this time we're diving into another episode of the Work and Play Podcast.
Ooh, fun.
To see what we can learn as podcasters from how they interview their guest.
Okay, so their guest this time is coming from the corporate world, and they're kind of transitioning into entrepreneurship.
Right.
All right, so let's see what we can glean from this episode and what other podcasters can learn.
One of the things I really noticed was how they made the guest feel so comfortable right from the get-go. The host has a very conversational tone.
Right.
And sprinkles in a lot of positive affirmations.
Yes.
Like, I think that's really cool, or that's amazing.
Yeah, and that can go such a long way in just making a guest feel encouraged and comfortable.
Especially when maybe they're sharing some more personal details on something.
Yeah, for sure.
So I noticed that the host starts off with this really broad question. How would you describe work and play and even how your current life is set up?
So it's just a broad kind of open-ended question to get them going.
Yeah, it's not a yes or no answer.
Oh, right.
It's very open-ended, which, I feel like when you ask a question like that, you get a lot more insight into who this person is and how they view the world.
Yeah, rather than just getting a one-sentence answer.
Yeah, and not leading them in any way.
Right.
So it's really letting them take the lead.
Yeah, and it's so important to just ask those well-crafted questions as a podcast host because it unlocks so much. And then the host, they're a great active listener too. They asked a lot of follow-up questions that keep that conversation going. And that flow is so important as a podcast host. You don't want to just have dead air.
No, you want to keep it going. And they pick up on these subtle cues from the guest.
Yes.
Like when the guest mentions feeling FOMO, like the fear of missing out, they immediately latch on to that.
Yeah.
And kind of dig deeper into that.
And that just makes the guest feel so heard and understood.
Yeah.
Which is so important for building rapport.
And trust. And kind of that connection, I guess, to make it feel like they're just having a conversation.
Yeah.
Rather than, being interviewed.
Yeah, for sure.
One thing they do, which I thought was really interesting, was paraphrasing.
Okay.
So to make sure they're understanding what the guest is saying. So at one point the host says, so it's like you automatically get that energy and stimulation.
Right.
And you're like, okay, I got to be on this level.
So they're kind of just summing up.
Yeah, it's like
to make sure they're on the right track.
Checking for understanding.
Yeah.
Not just passively listening.
Yeah, for sure.
But actively trying to engage and process what the guest is saying.
And another thing that they do that's impressive is, so they're this great listener, but they also keep the conversation on track.
Yeah.
It doesn't meander too much.
Right.
They guide the guest through specific topics,
Right.
So they're constantly keeping in mind where this conversation needs to go.
Yes. And they do it very subtly.
Right.
It's not like they're cutting them off.
Yeah.
Or completely changing the subject.
Yeah.
It's very natural the way they do it.
Right.
So, I noticed they summarize what the guest has been talking about, and then they seamlessly transition to a new topic.
Right.
But a related question.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's like a natural progression. It's not like, okay, we're done with that.
Right, yeah.
Now let's talk about this.
Exactly.
It's a very natural flow.
It keeps the listener engaged. It makes sense.
Yes. So there's this one example where the host summarizes the guest comments about their parents' work ethic.
Okay.
And then asks, so what was the first seed of entrepreneurship in its formal, term?
Right.
And it just makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a natural question to follow up on the previous conversation. When the guest was talking about his dad quitting his job,
right,
the host shares about their experience as a parent, and it immediately makes it
more authentic, more real.
Yeah, and more relatable.
Right. They're not this perfect podcast host.
Person.
Right.
Yeah.
They've been there.
I've been there too.
And I think vulnerability is so important as a host.
Yes.
To connect with the guest, but also to connect with your listener.
Right.
To show them that you're human.
Yes. Yeah, and you're not afraid to share your experiences.
Yeah.
Which then makes the guest, I think, feel more comfortable.
Absolutely.
Sharing their experiences as well. So it's a really great technique, I think.
I agree.
That more podcasters should employ. Especially when it's relevant. It's not just random.
Right.
It's related to the conversation, which this was.
Yeah, for sure. I thought that was really great.
Okay, so we've talked about how great they are at making their guests feel comfortable. They're active listening, keeping the conversation on track.
Yeah.
And sprinkling in those personal anecdotes.
Right.
But what about connecting with the listener?
Yeah. That's such a key component of a successful podcast.
Yeah.
And this host does a great job with that.
Yeah.
They connect with their audience by constantly reminding them of how the guest's story can help them in their lives.
Right.
So this podcast's target audience is aspiring entrepreneurs.
Right.
And the host frames the guest's insights in a way that directly resonates with them.
Yeah,
like
yes.
saying, if you're thinking about leaving your job, listen to this.
Yeah.
And so it makes the episode super valuable
Yeah.
to the target audience.
Yeah, it's not just like, oh, this is a good story, but it's like, how can you use this to better your own life?
Exactly.
Or your own journey?
Uh-huh.
So I think that's a really great technique as well,
It is.
because it keeps the listener engaged.
And it makes it so much more valuable to them.
Yes. So there are a lot of strengths,
Yes.
but I did notice a couple of areas where they could improve.
Yeah, I agree.
So one thing was the interruptions.
The interruptions, yeah.
Yeah, like I know in a normal conversation, people interrupt each other all the time.
Uh-huh.
But I feel like as a podcast host,
It's different.
you really need to try to let your guest,
Finish their thought.
and share what they're trying to say.
And those interruptions, even if they're unintentional,
Yes.
can make the guest feel a little bit,
Like less comfortable.
less comfortable. And also, it kind of disrupts the flow
Yeah.
of the conversation.
Yeah, I noticed there was one specific example when the guest was sharing a story about his father,
Okay.
and the host interrupted to adjust the microphone.
I think I remember that part.
Yeah, and it was just like this jarring
Yeah.
moment where it's like, oh,
Uh-huh.
okay, we're back to the podcast.
Yeah.
It took me out of this story a little bit.
Right. I see what you mean.
Yeah.
So what else?
So the other thing I noticed was they sometimes ask multiple questions at once,
Yes, I agree.
which can be confusing
Very confusing.
because you're like, okay,
Which one do I answer?
yeah, which one are you asking me?
Right.
And it makes it harder for the listener, I think, to follow along. So like there was one point
Yeah.
where the host was asking about the guest's early experiences with entrepreneurship,
Okay.
and they just kind of like threw out all these questions in a row.
Like a rapid fire.
And it was like, whoa.
Yeah, okay.
What are we talking about?
Now we going with this.
Yeah.
So,
So I think as podcasters, we need to be really mindful
yes.
of
Yes. One question.
and just ask one clear question
Yes.
at a time.
Yeah. Makes it so much easier for everyone
Yes.
involved,
Yeah.
especially the listener. So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what's one key takeaway that you'll be implementing in your own podcasting journey?
I think for me, I'm going to be more conscious of my questions,
Okay.
asking clear and concise questions one at a time,
Yeah.
and giving my guests space to answer fully
I like that.
without interrupting.
Yeah. Quality over quantity.
Exactly.
For me, it's a reminder to always be learning and growing as a podcaster.
Yeah,
There's always room for improvement.
absolutely.
And I think studying the work of other podcasters is a great way to find inspiration and new techniques.
I completely agree. It's a journey of continuous improvement.
It is, and it's more fun when we can do it together as a community. So to all our fellow podcasters out there, keep experimenting, keep learning, and keep sharing your voices with the world.
And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope you found it insightful and inspiring.
We'll see you next time.